There was this English school teacher named Edwin Abbott. And he wrote years ago this piece of political satire called Flatland. Now, when he wrote it, he was trying to make a commentary about Victorian English society. But when I read the details about this, I hear in it echoes of John chapter 1 and 1 John chapter 1. The best way to describe this story is to imagine this is a two-dimensional world called Flatland. Now, granted, we know this is three-dimensional because it has that little edge, but let's just ignore that and say this is a two-dimensional area called Flatland. Now, in Flatland live two-dimensional beings, little squares and triangles and circles. And when they look at each other, you go up to a triangle. Remember, it's two-dimensional. So you know it's a triangle because you see a dot at a point and you see a line going this way and this way. And oh, it's a triangle. Or if you walk around it, you'd see three sides. It's a triangle. If you're a square and you walk around and you see a line and a point, a line and a point, and you do that enough times, you see four sides. Oh, it's a square. So that's how they live in their two-dimensional existence. They know north, south, east, and west. But they don't know up. Their little necks can't turn up. And they wouldn't know how to conceive of what they saw if they did. Now, in this little two-dimensional flatland lives Mr. Square. Mr. Square is going about his day. He goes into his little square house. There's nobody else in the room with him. But he hears this voice. Because you see, out in three-dimensional space around him is Mr. Sphere. Mr. Sphere has wandered up upon Flatland. And he'd like to say hello. Again, Mr. Square can't look up to know that Mr. Sphere is right above him. So Mr. Sphere looks down, can see inside the house, can see Mr. Square inside the house, and he booms out, hello. Mr. Square looks around the house. I don't see anybody. I must be hearing things. Mr. Sphere gets a little bit closer. Hello. At this point, Mr. Square is convinced he has lost his mind. This big, booming voice seems to be speaking straight into his insides, like this voice is resonating inside of him. He hears it. He doesn't know where it's coming from. Mr. Sphere decides to try some other approach. He is going to enter into Mr. Square's existence. He's going to enter the area where Mr. Square is. So, remember, he's a three-dimensional object entering 2D space. So as he gets in, what does it look like to Mr. Square? At this point, it's just a little dot. As Mr. Sphere moves through Flatland, he sees a little line. Because remember, he sees in two-dimensional space. As Mr. Sphere gets more and more in there towards the middle, the widest part, that line is bigger and bigger and bigger. But as Mr. Sphere goes through to the other tip of the ball, that line gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And now Mr. Sphere has entered into Mr. Square's existence and left it. He's entered and he's left it. And Mr. Square can't explain what he has seen. I saw a dot, I saw a line, and I saw it grow, and then I saw it shrink, and now it's gone. I'm having quite a day. I don't know what's going on. And he says again, I must be crazy. He says it out loud. I must be losing my mind. Well, Mr. Sphere has another idea. This will get his attention. This will tell him more about me and who it is that's talking to him. So now here he is underneath Mr. Square. He knocks on him from underneath, expelling Mr. Square from Flatland. Now he's floating through three-dimensional space. He's floating up, whatever that means, in three-dimensional space, whatever that is. He doesn't know up or down or left. He doesn't know what's going on. He just knows that he's floating around and this is really alien day and I shouldn't have got out of bed this morning. As he's floating up there, he looks down and he sees Flatland, this world that he left. And he sees his friends, little squares and circles and triangles. And he's only seen them from the side. He's only seen them from the side and kind of figured out what they are. But now he sees them from above. He sees that they have space on the inside of the shape. And he sees what it is like to move around in Flatland, but from another perspective. He's never seen anything like this. He doesn't really have language to describe what he's seeing, but he's seeing it. And he's beginning to understand things from Mr. Spear's point of view. Gradually, he floats back down onto Flatland. He lands there, and remember, it's two-dimensional space, so when he left, he disappeared. When he gets back, boom, he's there. His friends see him radically just appear out of nowhere. Mr. Square, where were you? We were worried sick. How did you just appear all of a sudden? You disappeared, and now you reappeared out of thin air. What is going on? Well, Mr. Square tells them, I heard this voice speaking inside of me when no one else was there. And this voice took me up to a place I'd never been, a place called up. And I can't explain it to you other than it's more than what we've got here. It's up. It's around here. Well, what is up? Well, it's this place above here, and there's this other being, and he's not quite like us. He's more than us. And he showed me things I had never seen from his perspective. And I think he brought me back so that I could tell others about him. And of course, Mr. Square's friends gather around him, pat him on the head. Poor Mr. Square. He has surely lost his mind. But he must be tired. Or as we'd say in the South, bless his heart. Mr. Square has quite a story to tell to people who aren't really going to believe him. And when we read the Gospel of John, John has a story to tell. Now, a lot of people are going to believe, but many people won't. Just like Mr. Square would come back and say, I swear this happened. You've got to believe me. I know it doesn't make sense to you, but I swear I went up to this place and I saw this, and this being revealed himself to me. John would say in John chapter 1, and in 1 John chapter 1, no, you've got to believe me. This really happened. If we read in 1 John chapter 1, he says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. For John, in his gospel and in his first epistle, this really happened. We saw him, we heard him, we ate meals with him, we touched him. If we read later on in John's gospel, we see Thomas, who was in doubt after Jesus has risen from the grave. Thomas says, I'm not going to believe until I put my hand in his nail-scarred hands. And Jesus says, come on, do it. Let me show you I'm real. So John shows throughout his writings, this really did happen. This is no made-up fairy tale. That God intersected with man. But the difference between how God did it and how Mr. Spear did it was Mr. Spear entered Flatland. He never changed how he was. He never changed his shape. He never changed anything about the way he looked. And it was a little confusing. But when Jesus entered our experience, that's God in the flesh who came into our world looking like one of us, entering our experience in a way beyond what we could ever deserve, in a way that we would understand better. When we read John chapter 1, we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So God, who created everything, who is the Creator, entered into our existence in Jesus Christ. John makes it clear He's the Creator, that He's with God the Father from the beginning, that He is the creative principle, that when God plants a garden, I imagine it is Jesus out there digging in the roots, just like we see in the Gospels that Jesus presents Himself as the gardener who is taking care of the vineyard, that we serve a God who gets His hands dirty. I love that about our God, that He rolls up His sleeve and He gets to work in the way that He forms man, and in the way that He forms the vineyard, in the way that He creates us, that He can speak a word, speak existence in, but when it comes to us, He gets His hands dirty. He gets down in the dirt. When it comes to protecting us, He digs around the roots. We serve a God who gets His hands dirty and is not afraid to enter into our existence. Now, when John the Baptist came, he's a little bit like Mr. Square in the sense that God has revealed to him something, and he's got to tell other people about it. But just like Mr. Square wasn't believed, John the Baptist wasn't always believed. There were a lot of people that went out into the desert to hear from John the Baptist, this guy that wore camel hair and ate locusts, and he's preaching repentance. And they say, well, I got to see this guy. And they come, and they believe, and they repent of their sins, and they're baptized with water. And John says, in the first chapter of his gospel, but you haven't seen nothing yet. I'm not the light. I come to testify about the light, because the one who is coming after me is before me. He's from the beginning. He's the creator of the world. The one who's coming next is Jesus, and He baptizes in the Spirit. You've got to see Him. You've got to meet Him. And John walks about trying to tell people about Jesus, and a lot of people believe, but there's some that don't. And they plot, ultimately successfully, to kill Him. Just as when Jesus comes, people will flock around Him. And of those people, some are just in for the show. Who's this Jesus guy? But some of them believe. And some of them are ultimately martyred for their faith. But we look at verse 10 in John, that He came into the world that He created. The world that He created, His world. But it did not recognize Him. We look in verse 11. He came to that which was His own, but His own did not receive Him. Yet to all who received Him, to those who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So, when we read through John's Gospel, one of the key questions that comes up is a question that Jesus asked His disciples. Who do people say I am? And they turn to the question and say, but who do you say I am? It's a question that He still extends to us today. Who do we say Jesus is? The question that existed back in John's Gospel still exists for us today. I think I told you all a few weeks ago, a Time magazine cover, a Life magazine cover, on a newsstand in the grocery store with a picture of Jesus that said, who do you say I am? Because we're still asking the question. We haven't all resolved in our hearts who Jesus truly is. And so the question still exists. And there were false teachings that were going on as this book was being written together. As God was putting together His Word, false teachers were trying to get into the church and try to corrupt the message of God. So as we read through John, we see John responding to that. He's very intentional about the language that he used. One of the false teachings that existed back then was this teaching called Gnosticism. And the Gnostics believed that word gnosis meant knowledge. They said we have a special knowledge. We're the smartest, but we're also the most exclusive. It's a small club. We've got our members-only robes, And if you're in the club, you've got all this access to this special and secret knowledge. But we'll tell you a few pieces of it, so you'll know how smart we are. A little status symbol. And one of the things that they taught, they said there's matter and energy, and that all matter is bad. Matter is just evil, only spirit and energy is good. So they reasoned from that, well, if all matter is bad, then God couldn't have come in the flesh, because God wouldn't be corrupted by a bad body, a bad matter. He wouldn't touch that. Which, of course, is simply not true. We know that Jesus came in the flesh. And John lays it out very clearly in his gospel. He says, no, he came. When we look at 1 John chapter 1, say we touched him. He was there. The Gnostics try to tell all these stories, and if you ever hear any of these things on TV about, oh, we discovered a book that didn't make it into the Bible, the church leaders were trying to hide something from us. Well, I've read some of those books. One of them tells about Jesus' body being on the cross, the spirit being down at the foot of the cross, and he's laughing at it. One of them says that if a lion is a human, the lion becomes a human and is blessed. Weird stuff. So if you ever say, why didn't those books make it in the Bible? Don't go reading them. I'll tell you all about them. I've got copies of them and then scriptural annotations saying this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. We can talk about it. But there is a lot of false teaching that people were trying to put in. The Gnostics were trying to say, well, we're the true Christianity. And John would say, no. No. You teach that Jesus didn't arrive in the flesh. I saw him. I was there with him. I ate with him. I could hear his heartbeat behind me. No. He came in the flesh. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus asked that question, who do people say I am? The disciples say, well, some people think you're one of the prophets that died, came back. You're this guy or you're this guy who died and came back. It's some kind of reincarnation. There was that false belief that was going on. And then, of course, Jesus said, well, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you're the Son of God. You're the Messiah. That Peter gets it. There were stories that were written in pseudepigraphal text in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There were stories that have, again, Gnostic writings and other things that were out there that tried to say that there was an angel, and this angel became a human, and that was Jesus. Which, again, puts Jesus on the level of a created thing. That's not the case. John lays it out here, says, no. Jesus is not a created thing. He's the creator. He was not some angel. That he is fully God. He is fully man. He is the Son of God. And he came in the flesh. Let me tell you about it. So John is combating all of this stuff as he writes. If knowing all that background going in, when you read the first chapter of John, or the first chapter of 1 John, you see John is making it very clear. No. God entered into our existence. Into our little flatland. God entered in. God has done the unbelievable, the incredible. We have several different strains of different religions that exist today. There are not mainline Mormonism, but an offshoot of Mormonism that teaches this thing called adoptionism. That says Jesus was just a good guy. And I tell you this because you may run into this teaching. They say that Jesus was just a good guy who was just a mortal, and God adopted him because he was such a good guy. So offshoots of Mormonism, some Unitarianism, modern Jehovah's Witnesses. I know we have a large Jehovah's Witness population. I'm not disparaging them. They may be good people, but they believe a false doctrine, and it's very sad. People can maybe otherwise be good people are buying into a lie. If you get into a conversation with Jehovah's Witness, and you start to talk about the Trinity, you'll find they'll try to present Christianity, we believe the same thing that Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians do. That's not the case. If you start to talk about the Trinity, they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They believe he was a created being who was a good guy and is kind of adopted in. So when you hear certain things like this, sometimes you'll hear it on news broadcasts, particularly around Easter. There used to be a news broadcast about this new finding that we found from some ancient manuscript that dispels Christianity. It's nothing new. Don't believe it. Half of the junk that gets put out there around Easter time concerning Jesus by the supposed experts or by people who don't believe in Jesus. And they're trying to present as something new, something that John has presented as false way back in the Bible. It is nothing new. Don't fall for it. don't believe that Jesus was just some good guy who did a couple magic tricks and God said, you're in my kingdom now. That he is the Son of God, he's the Creator, and he is intersected into our reality. So Jesus is presented by John's Gospel in very intentional language to say he did arrive. He is the Son of God in the flesh. But the world didn't recognize him. Just like they didn't recognize him then, a lot of people don't recognize him now. Whether it's from some false teaching or maybe they just don't believe at all. But a lot of times people don't recognize him now as the God who came near. It reminds me of a story by Paul Harvey. You may have heard this. It plays on Christian radio just about every Christmas. On his radio anyway. But he tells a story of a man who he didn't believe that God could appear in the flesh of Jesus Christ. He said, I just don't think God would do that. He didn't really believe. And his family was going to a Christmas Eve service. He said, I just don't believe that. I'm not going to go because I don't believe any of that. I feel like I'm a hypocrite. I'm just going to stay at home, do a little light reading. So he stays at home. His family goes off. They try to talk him into it. He's not going to go. They go off to this Christmas Eve service. He's sitting by the fire, reading his newspaper, when he hears really loudly. Well, what that was. A little while later. What is this loud thud? And he turns and he sees out the window. It's been snowing, and it's just so much snow all over the place. And 3 little birds are trapped out in the snow. They have nowhere to go. He says, well, I just can't let them freeze to death out there. I got to do something. So he puts on this big, puffy winter coat, his boots, a hat. He goes out there. He says, if I can open the barn doors, then maybe they'll fly in there. They'll be safe. They won't freeze to death. So he opens wide the doors, but the birds don't go in. If I turn the light on, they'll see the light, they'll feel the warmth, they'll be drawn to it, and they will come inside. But he does that. He opens the doors, he turns on the light, and they're not drawn in. He runs around and he tries to kind of shoo them in. Just go, go. At this point, they're just freaked out. They fly everywhere. They scatter. They don't understand what I'm saying. I could say, go, 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 but they don't speak a word of English. If I could speak bird, if I didn't look like a big scary guy in a big winter coat, if I looked like one of them, if I looked like a little bird and spoke bird, if I could enter into their experience like a little bird and then come tell them, hey, they're going to freeze to death. There's a little place of warmth over here. Maybe then, if I could show up like one of them, they would understand. And that's when the irony hit him. But that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. And he fell to his knees in the snow. Jesus said that he is the way, the truth, and the life in John 14:6. That he is the way, the truth, and the life. Just as this guy would say, there's only one way to survival. I've opened wide the doors, I've turned on the light, there's warmth, if you would just go in. Jesus extends the invitation to us. He says there's one way. There's one way to God the Father, and it's through Jesus. He says he's the way, the truth, the life. Not a way, not a good suggestion. A possible road out of many on a road map. I'm the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. In John chapter 8, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about his identity. It's unusual out of all the Gospels how clear he is in John chapter 8 about his identity, about who he is. And he's talking to the religious leaders, the people who should get it, people who have the Bible literally memorized. And he's talking to these religious leaders, and they just don't get it. He's saying who he is, and they don't believe him. He talks about how they should be following God. They say, oh, we have a father, and it's Abraham. We're the children of Abraham. And because we're in his bloodline, God made a promise to Abraham. We're in his bloodline. We're good. We're set. As though the family tree is enough to save you. But Jesus tells them, it doesn't matter that you're Abraham's children. That's not enough to save you. He says, you're so worried about Abraham as your father. Who you should be worried about is God the Father. Not worried about your heritage. It says you think you're worshiping God the Father through Abraham your father, but what you're really doing is worshiping your father, the devil. You don't even know it. I think a lot of people today, they're worshiping the devil and the lifestyle that they choose. They're treating him as father and say, I worship God the Father. When was the last time you spoke to him? Have you spent any time with him? And we're spending time with our father, Satan. We don't even know it. It's a gradual walk from one to the other sometimes, that we turn from God, our Father. And Jesus basically says to them, you're so concerned with your ancestral identity. You're so concerned with being able to say, Abraham is my father, that if you really knew God the Father, you would know his Son. If he was your father, you would know his Son, Jesus Christ. You would know him when he came, but clearly you don't because your father is the devil. Again, the message that John puts out here is the same message for us. That we need to know God our Father. Just like the Flatlanders couldn't conceive of an area called up. The Jewish leaders of the day couldn't conceive of God arriving in the flesh and intersecting with mankind in a way that they hadn't expected. They thought they had all of Scripture figured out. God only arrives this way. God only moves and works in the world in the way that I think that he should. If he hasn't checked off my checklist, well, it must not be God. Jesus makes it very clear. I show up the way I'm going to show up. God intersects with man the way he's going to do it. May not be how we expect. May not be the way that we anticipated, the way we would choose. But God shows up. He has showed up in our past, but he continues to intersect. He shows up and he saves us, but he continues to intersect with our life. And it might be disruptive. We might feel like Mr. Square. You remember, Mr. Square was in his little two-dimensional flatland minding his business when he was knocked from beneath and went flying. And I don't know how many of you have had in your faith journey an experience like that, where you feel like God came up from behind you and just flew out there. I watched a great little YouTube video the other day of this little boy singing that old hymn. He said, he plunged me to victory. But he didn't say it right. He said, he punched me to victory. And the little caption said, sometimes I need to be punched to victory. Sometimes we feel like God has just kind of pushed us or shoved us into this wonderful and revelatory experience of himself. And he said, I feel like I can experience God. I feel like I'm seeing God. I'm seeing who he is. He's showing himself to me. He's showing me his will, and I don't understand it, but I'm just along for the ride. Sometimes I think Christianity feels like a really fast roller coaster. You strap in and say, okay, God, where are you going to take me? I'm just along for the ride. I'll go where you lead me. I don't know where we're going or what we're going to do when we get there, but God, you just lead me. And maybe you're feeling a little bit like Mr. Square sometimes. You felt like God has lifted you up and he's shown you something in a way you would never have thought of before. And you've experienced life in a way, and you see things in a perspective like Mr. Square, you see things from the perspective of Mr. Sphere. Maybe you have had those moments where you feel like you're experiencing things from God's eyes, that you can see the insides of people like Mr. Square can see his friends. You can see the insides of people from God's eyes. But you can see the world from God's eyes. You can have those little revelations of God and say, I think he's showing me something. A way to understand things and care for people, and not to say that you've wrapped your mind around the whole universe and certainly don't understand everything there is to know about God. But God is showing me something. He's teaching me things. I'm just along for the ride. And like Mr. Square, who plops back down to Flatland, that when you feel like God has picked you up and shown you some things, that when he sets you back down again, you say, I've got to tell somebody. I don't really have the language to convey everything I've been shown. I don't really have the words. I can't express the emotion and the joy and the peace that God has put within himself to us. To be more and more like him every day. And to be like Mr. Square, who was sent to tell other people about Mr. Sphere. To be like John the Baptist, who was sent to tell people about Jesus before he came. That we have the great responsibility to show and to share what we have learned. We can be like those people in John chapter 8 who relied upon their religious pedigree. Say, Mama was a Christian. Mama was a great Christian, so I guess that means I'm a Christian. Mama was saved. I guess that means I'm saved. I'm a good person, as though our good could some way outweigh our bad, but we're never good enough. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the years where someone says, I'm basically good. I'm here to tell you where John tells us that we're all basically bad. And in Romans we read that we all fall short. None of us measure up. We all fall short of the glory of God. But it's for the grace of God that He picks us up, He dusts us off, and He makes us more like Him. He claims us as His own. As John chapter 1 says, that He gave us the right to become children of God, those that believe in His name. Not that we've earned it, because we're such good people. Not that we've earned it because Mama was a good Christian. You know, I've seen churches over the years where people have dedicated money to the church, so they bought a pew, or there's a stained glass window and they bought that, or on the sidewalk up there where people have given financially, or something, maybe it's not financially, something is dedicated to them, where a chapel is dedicated to this great Christian who came before to honor them. We've got a trail. Actually, we've got a trail that's been dedicated to Mr. Ensko. And those are all wonderful things. But you can't say that because something was dedicated to my granddad or dedicated to my grandma, that means I get into heaven. They would want you to know Jesus for yourself. They wouldn't want you trying to ride their coattails to heaven. I'm not trying to get political here, but I think sometimes we think that going to heaven is like chain migration. You know, Mama got in, I get in. And all my friends get it. It's not like that. That we get to heaven because of what did John say? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, the life. Mama's not the way. Daddy's not the way. Being a good person's not the way. Knowing somebody or being connected through your family to somebody who is saved and they were just a great person and they gave the church and things were dedicated, that's all great, that's wonderful, and we should honor those people. But that doesn't get us to heaven. That those people would be the first to tell you, oh, you're not getting into heaven because of me. You need to know Jesus. If they could come back from the dead and tell us and say, you're not coming because of me. You need to know Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. And I want you there in heaven with me because of your own relationship with Jesus Christ. We learn in Acts 4:12 that there is no other name under heaven by which men are saved. It's only in the name of Jesus Christ. It ain't your name. Now, I might be disappointed to say, there was no blank in the scripture for me to write my name in there. Or somebody else's name. It's only Jesus. So my question to you this morning is, what might God be trying to tell you? In what ways might God be intersecting with Flatland? Might be intersecting with your life? In what ways might God be showing up and you say, I didn't expect Him to show up that way? I didn't expect Him to present Himself, to reveal Himself in that way. Yes, God showed up in these pages of Scriptures, and hopefully He has showed up in your life when He saved you, and I hope you are saved, and if you're not, we need to talk about it. God shows up in your life at that time, but it's not just a one-time thing. God saves us for His kingdom, for eternity, and once you're saved, you're always saved. But God continues to save us every day from ourselves. I don't know how many times you can think back to things in your life where you should have had some really bad consequences for something, and God saved your tail, and you say, God saved me. Jesus saved me. I should have been toast. I should have been dust. But God saved me. I don't know how many times that you've been in a difficult situation, you say, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should go north or south or east or west. And God says, I know a direction called up. And we return it to Him, and He gives us that guidance. And say, it was only God. I could have never got through it myself. It was only God. What might God be calling you to do for Him? Just like He's spoken to Mr. Square, or Mr. Sphere spoken to Mr. Square into his insides, he couldn't see anybody. How might God be speaking into you? And you say, I don't see anybody. I think this is God. My friends might treat me like Mr. Square was treated. Oh, bless their heart, they must have lost their mind. But in what ways am I being called to show God to people? That I can say it with my mouth, and I should, but I also need to show it in my actions. This mercy that I've been shown. we said at one of the Wednesday night Bible studies, and I told the 8 o'clock service this, that I had not planned on putting this in my notes or anything, but just God reveals things in Bible study, and I hope you'll be a part of the small group because it's certainly influencing me. That we had this conversation about when your child does something wrong, you still love them. That's your child, no matter what. And we talk about our relationship with God, and in John it says we get the privilege of being called a child of the King. Once you're His child, you're His child. Go mess up. And He disciplines us because He loves us and He wants the best for us. And I saw something on Facebook, I forget who posted it, might have been one of y'all, but somebody had posted that they were having this conversation with their child, and this has happened a lot, where they're fussing at their child for disobeying a rule. And say, why don't you just obey the rules? I only make them for your own good. And that they could feel spiritually God standing behind them saying, yeah. How's that working? That God is saying to them the same thing they're saying to their child. That as I'm fussing at my child, why don't you just do, I mean this for your own good. It's not just to hear myself talk, I mean it for your own good. And then God is saying, yeah, why don't you? That we have to keep in mind as we fuss at our children, grandchildren, nieces, or nephews, yes, God also has plans for our own good, not to harm us, but to prosper us, to give us a life and give it more abundantly. That He is constantly, like the man who's calling out to those birds to try to come in. God is constantly calling us out of the cold. And we might think, oh, he's this big scary man in the big jacket. He's trying to save us. He's trying to protect us, not just in salvation with Him for eternity, which is very important, but day by day. That God reveals Himself to us. He intersects with our reality. How is He intersecting with yours? What is God leading you to do? Is there someone you're supposed to tell about Jesus and you haven't talked to them, and God is leading you to talk to them about Jesus? Is there someone that you're supposed to show love and mercy to this week? Who might God be leading you to tell them about Him and to show them about Him? Maybe this morning you need to make a decision to follow Jesus for the first time. You say, I don't have that relationship with Jesus. I know about Him. I know that He died on the cross for my sins, that I can be set free. I know that He rose on the third day. But I've never trusted Him as my Savior. We'd love to talk with you about that this morning. Maybe you've walked away from the faith and you just want to trust Him more. You say, I just need to return to Him. Maybe this morning you say, I'd love to join the life of this church. I want to join as a member. Just to be with other Christians who have kind of been like those other squares and circles and Flatland. Say, we're in this together, and we've the experience of God who raises us up from our existence and teaches us about Himself. And we just want to be with other people who share that experience. We want to join them in membership. We'd love to have you as a member. You don't have to fully comprehend the majesty of God in order to follow Him. Little Mr. Square didn't really fully wrap his mind around what a sphere was. He'd never seen one of those in his life. But he knew enough to share with his friends what he didn't know. We don't have to fully understand God in order to follow Him. And for one, I'm glad that God is beyond my own understanding. If I knew everything there was to know about God, I'd probably think I didn't need Him. I'd say, oh, I know everything now. But God reveals to me very clearly, I ain't know everything. There's more for me to learn. There's more for me to grow in. And that is true for all of us. I hope this morning, however God leads you, that you will make the decision to follow Him as we sing this final song. Please stand.